All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining the SaltStack webinar in the Best of SaltComp 16 webinar series. Sorry about that, just had to mute everybody. This is the Best of SaltComp 16 webinar titled Building Web Platforms at Scale with SaltStack and Docker. Today we are joined by Ron Williams and Wayne Moore of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Thank you for joining this morning. Just a couple pieces of housekeeping before we get started. First of all, my name is Rhett Glauser. I'm with SaltStack, and we've been very pleased to provide this webinar series. We had our big user conference, SaltComp 16, back in April, and since then we've had quite a bit of very positive feedback on a bunch of the talks and presentations that we gave at that conference. Obviously, many people didn't have access or the ability to join us in person. And so we've been making those talks available via this webinar series, at least about a handful of those. So far, we've had great talks from folks at Adobe and Future Advisor and Cloudera. Today, we've got a great talk and presentation from Ron and Wayne with USDA. And so we'll get to their content here in just a minute. As we just heard at the beginning of the call, we are muting all lines to preserve quality of the audio. And we're doing that because we are recording this webinar, and we'll provide the recording to all registered attendees after the fact, probably within about 24 hours. You should see an email from us with a link to that recording. Obviously, feel free to share that with your coworkers, friends, but because the lines are muted, if you do have any questions, and we welcome questions and hope you do have questions for us, please enter them through the chat function within GoToMeeting there. And we'll get to as many as we can. Possibly, if we don't get to them, we'll make sure to follow up with you after the fact directly to make sure all your questions have been answered. Before we hand over to Ron and Wayne, I just wanted to let everybody know that this webinar does assume some knowledge of SaltStack, that we're not providing an overview or introduction to the platform itself. There are great places to learn, though. If you're not familiar with docs at saltstack.com, great way to get started, great place to download the software, the Salt open source software, and to get up and running for things like configuration management, for remote execution, for cloud control and event-driven orchestration. We got that very simple diagram of the Salt architecture and platform there. There are a lot of things you can do with Salt. It's a very powerful tool, and we'll hear from Ron and Wayne here in a minute more about some of those features and functions. If you do have any other questions, if there's any other way we can help you with your Salt experience, just send us a note at sales@saltstack.com and be happy to do that. So with that, let me turn over to Ron and give him presenter rights here. And we'll jump into the main reason everybody's attended today. Ron, let me get you off mute. You should now have presenter rights. I can see your slides now. It sounds like I can hear your audio as well. So take it away, Ron.
Excellent. Hey, good morning, everyone, or possibly afternoon, depending on where you're located. I wanted to chat a little bit about the USDA web platform that we've been building with SaltStack and Docker. It's kind of started out of a project that started with an evaluation phase last July, and we've just continued to add additional features thanks to the power and functionality of SaltStack and Docker. I'm the USDA platform systems architect. So generally handle a lot of the technical integration pieces. We also have a team of systems administrators that also help with the implementation of the platform. And also on the call is Wayne Moore. I'll just let him go ahead and give a quick introduction on himself and the Office of Communications as well.
Okay, I'm the Agency Chief Information Officer for the Office of Communications. Basically, our group handles USDA.gov and then some smaller type websites within the department. Originally, what we were trying to do from a business standpoint was come up with a way to not only build an enterprise type solution, but also a way that we could do sharing of servers or in our instance right now, Drupal modules, but even expanding beyond that, but also apps and tools so that everybody's not building the same solution and ways that we could share solutions to cut government spending and things like that. So that was our goal when this first started. It started out with a couple sites and is now growing into probably close to 15 to 20 sites. But Ron can explain more on that. And Ron, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Good start introduction. Um, yeah, so when we started the initiative, we were trying to figure out how do we create a platform that is able to grow and is flexible looking towards the future. So if anybody here has worked with the Drupal, you know that Drupal 7 has been around a long time, has been relatively stable because of the simple test PHP framework integration. But Drupal 8 is on the horizon, and for some of the smaller brochureware type sites, it really is the version of Drupal that you should be building on. So when we were looking at the platform, we wanted to make sure that we did not encumber USDA to staying with an older version of Drupal or Drupal 7 in this case, with Drupal 8 coming online in the next probably 6 months. In fact, the platform already has one website that is scheduled to deploy with Drupal 8. I believe there's a second one in discussion for launching on the platform as well. So that was kind of the one part of hosting diverse applications. We also looked at how we could support Java-based applications such as Jira. So we did some initial testing of handling Jira inside of the platform. We actually decided to move that into the Atlassian cloud environment. But we still have the functionality to support systems that are Linux-based. Because we are heavily reliant on Docker, all of our sites are dependent on Linux, which is nice. That seems to be a very well-tested path within SaltStack as well. We also wanted the flexibility to move between data centers. So we have our data center in Kansas City, and we also have a data center in St. Louis, and then looking at cloud service offerings like AWS or Azure. In the future, we wanted to make sure that we weren't just building these systems manually and then being limited to how we could move those outside of the current data center or infrastructure stack. We also have an existing environment that is our production environment, which uses VMware, and we have a new environment that is OpenStack based, which has significantly lower costs associated with direct agency costs as well as cost of licensing, because OpenStack is open source. So we wanted to be able to deploy our dev environment within OpenStack, our test environment within OpenStack, and our production environment within VMware, and to be able to seamlessly move those configurations, states in this case, between the environments. Traditionally, server administration within government has been a manual process. So you put in a server request, you got a series of servers, you logged into each one. If you were lucky, you wrote a bash script, but as we all know, maintaining bash scripts doesn't really work well for your deployment and installation, which is where Salt comes into play. So we can reliably set up and deploy initial state as well as updates and additional configurations in the future. Previously, deployment times within USDA could take several months. So when I started at USDA, we put in a server request, and it took approximately 4 months to get the VM system accessible and online. That's a really long turnaround time. It can be kind of frustrating when you have an application that's ready to go, ready to be upgraded, but you just don't have a server that's available for usage. So we wanted to significantly reduce that deployment time. To date, our shortest deployment was 16 days from the time development completed to the time the site was in production, and that included wrapping the site with a CDN service, Akamai, as well as meeting the federal government HTTPS standards with HSTS TLS support. So currently, that mandate comes into place for the federal government as of December of this year, but we were able to meet that a year ahead of schedule because of the time savings with SALT. We were able to reuse that, take the time that we saved and go ahead and do additional functions with the platform. And then, of course, a major part of government web application deployments is security and monitoring of applications. And so we have, in several cases since the platform is launched, we've seen sustained attack attempts from external sources who were not so good. And because of the configurations that we're able to deploy en masse very quickly with SALT, we were able to deflect those attacks, and we were also able to ensure that all of the versions of each software that were up to date. They were the latest configuration, and when we needed to roll a security update, we were able to test that very quickly as well. A couple of cases we had to make changes to our configuration files to improve security. We were able to, of course, put that into a SALT state in a file.managed config and deploy that across all of our servers in a matter of seconds, rather than having to manually move those with bash scripts or just copying them through WinSCP, which is a very standard model prior to the platform. So when we started, we had a legacy system that was developed by another operations and maintenance vendor. And what we found is there were lots of good intentions with that system. This would be what I'll refer to as a legacy platform throughout the remainder of the session. The legacy system had Jenkins installed, but it wasn't running. Not much use when you simply have the package there. All of the services were manually managed. So literally 2 web servers online, you would SSH into one box, make changes to the Apache vhost configuration file if you wanted to add a new site, log out of that box, potentially either copy that file over or manually deploy or manually update the file through VI, again on the second server, performing various restarts, not really well orchestrated overall. And because of the legacy environment being such or requiring such a high amount of manual configuration, it didn't have a large number of more modern systems, or really any more modern system. So it had MySQL and had Apache, and I believe it also had some Solr services installed as well. But Apache only handles a couple hundred requests for Drupal pages that are intensive to generate. So we installed Varnish, and Varnish handles our routing into the container. It also allows us to put firewall rules in place, and basically act as a simple web application firewall. I wouldn't recommend Varnish being your only WAF configuration, but it is nice when you know that certain requests are coming in that meet a certain profile. You can really quickly drop those. And we deploy the configuration, which in in this case is a varnish configuration file, VCL file. All of that occurs through salt states. So we have a varnish state, we have an Apache Docker state, which has our Apache configuration, and that's kind of how we're orchestrating the deployment. Wayne, anything else on the legacy environment that you recall? Of course, we were kind of brought in at the end of that, so maybe you're a little more familiar about that just day-to-day operation of that environment in comparison to the
Well,
new one.
it was more of a situation where things took longer than expected at points because they were being done manually. I think the previous vendor had told them that a lot of it was automated, but the automation was a person sitting at midnight going screen by screen doing updates and things like that. So a lot of it was the old way of doing things, and our actual goal was to do things that can not only be automated, but can be managed rather quickly instead of the dependency on one or two key people to be involved in it.
Yeah, very good point. The midnight deployments can be, quite testing. And of course, if people get too tired, then, it's offline all night and then the next morning until they get back online. That's another point about Salt. We're able to, remove nodes from the cluster, perform updates, running a high state, running even a single state, performing Salt orchestration on segments of the platform during normal daytime hours. So we don't have to worry about taking, a few servers down, upgrading those to supporting new functionality that we're adding, and then bringing those back online and taking down the other half of the infrastructure. So a blue-green deployment really just wasn't possible in the legacy environment. So when we started the project, well, after we got past the initial evaluation of the legacy environment, basically determined that the best course of action would be to rebuild the environment, modernize, leave the legacy platform online for a period of time until the new platform could accommodate all of the functionality of that system. And of course, anytime that you're moving multiple websites from one environment to another, you want to have high confidence that the sites are going to be able to perform and handle the traffic. The servers are able to handle the traffic that's being directed at them. So we started with 4 sites that were identified. This was August 21st last year that we really kicked off the project, and the goal was by the end of September to have all 4 sites migrated over into production. We wanted to have our Apache and PHP configuration containerized, and we also had MySQL on an additional server. So we haven't containerized MySQL quite yet. That's about to come about in the next month. But we did want to orchestrate all of the container deployments. So there's, of course, Docker Swarm, which is beginning to provide the additional orchestration functionality. But last year at this time, that functionality really wasn't there. And of course, Docker Swarm is very much Docker-centric. So while you can do lots of things with the containers, when you're talking about managing security on the hosts, configuring SSH to be more restrictive or to integrate with Active Directory, we really need additional software that Salt provides to maintain and manage those hosts so they are in a secured and functional state. And then because we were building this, it was in 5 weeks. This was a high risk, but we figured we'll give it a try with Salt and Docker, and we'll see what we can pull off in 5 weeks. And at worst case, I've previously developed a platform at University of Colorado Boulder for their Housing and Dining Services department that maintains multiple websites for them as well. I figured if we get to the last 3 to 5 days, I'd just build it manually if it didn't work out. Thankfully, everything was able to migrate over at the end of by the end of September. So, as I mentioned, we were looking at how do we quickly deploy. We have seen our record time being 16 days from development completion to launch of the website, as I mentioned. Right now, we're probably around 20 days on average for those deployments, but we're hoping that we beat that deadline, as we do have some additional work that's coming up in the next few weeks. So we're hoping to see that, even if it's shortened by just a couple days, have that happen. We also wanted to reduce the hardware costs. So by being able to use SALT to deploy applications that allow us to leverage the servers in a more efficient manner, implementing MariaDB instead of, an older version of MySQL, configuring MariaDB to take advantage of additional caches, configuring Varnish to allow us to offload more to the cache rather than traffic into the individual Apache servers for each site. We really wanted to see how we could reduce hardware costs. Also using SALT and Docker, of course, SALT controlling the Varnish configuration file for the routing, in our case, we were able to eliminate servers. So generally, we would have 3 production servers at minimum and 3 dev test servers as well. And those would all be in the VMware stack because we had portability, we could do image cloning and things like that in a more traditional model. With SALT, of course, we were able to split those into 2 different hypervisors and have the additional testing that SALT provides when states report back that there was success in deployment. So in our case, we have container orchestration managed by SALT, and I'll go into an example of one of our states and how it's pulling in some of the Jinja variables from our pillar files. So for anybody who's not familiar with SALT, of course we have the states and then we have the pillars. The pillars generally contain secret information or less public, and the states are more generic and then pull information from those pillars. I'm sure somebody at SALT or maybe Tom could answer or define that a little bit better than I do. We also manage or use SALT to manage our application deployment and release. I'll have those states shown in the later slides as well. Again, these aren't fully functional states, so keep in mind that it is a section of the states. We are hoping to open source the next version of the platform, so that way we can collaborate with other groups. And we're also working with the Rancher community to implement a Rancher state for SALT. Currently, they have other configuration management tools and orchestration tools supporting Rancher automatically. We're hoping to do the same thing with SALT. And then, of course, private data deployment, that's all managed within the pillars. We have some states that handle our email configuration. So we don't want to open source what our internally open mail relays are. We want that in a pillar file, but we still want to share the states with other groups so they can take a look at it. We've had good feedback by working with the open source community. We've done some work throughout this project on the SALT formulas for MySQL. Being a government agency or part of a government agency, we're generally using Red Hat for our deployments. We find that the open source community is using Ubuntu and even the Amazon Web Services Linux variant, which doesn't really apply to our use case. So we've been able to open source some of our Red Hat specific configurations or improve the functionality of the states over the last year. And then security patch validation really just comes down to are the states being applied properly, and is Yum executing updates appropriately, and what is the feedback loop on those? So currently we are integrating with a series of services, and this is a significant change. Generally, previous systems were very much closed. The firewalls were very restrictive. We've opened the environment in a safe manner to allow us to interface with the services listed on the screen, Docker Hub, GitHub, and Atlassian Cloud. And those really just allow us to pull directly from Docker Hub rather than hosting our own images within USDA. There's really no reason for our Docker images to be closed source. It's more costly to run those servers or to pay for a subscription for a private repository. So Salt allows us to provide evidence to the firewall teams that we are restricting access on the individual machines to only a certain trusted sources or trusted services. So we were able to open up internet connectivity to these services and a few others that are spam control related. In the case of Drupal, generally within a government data center, you're not able to see the updates that are needed for your application because Drupal can't phone out to Drupal.org. So we're able to show application administrators the security status of their Drupal site with the platform. And that these are some services that that were desired with the legacy platform, but either were not implemented or only partially implemented. I think in the case of Apache Solr. So Varnish, of course, provides our routing, cache offload. It's been around for a while. Consul is key store. We're using that for our Docker networks, basically storing information on virtual address space to those networks, so containers communicate across hosts without issue. And so we were able to add these services reliably by using salt states. So we can add an additional server, and we know that Varnish is going to deploy exactly the way that it's deployed on the other two already. So as I mentioned earlier, we have container orchestration. This is pulling variables from a pillar file. And so we have site name. We're starting the Docker container. Docker support in Salt, because the Docker software is moving so quickly, Salt is also moving so quickly. Sometimes we have found that we've switched between Docker NG and Docker IO. So you'll see various use cases, sometimes even a shell script, I think, is used in one case later. So just keep that in mind as we're looking at these states, that the Docker states, you may need to switch between the two. I do believe that Docker NG is going to replace Docker IO. So, I believe it will take over that namespace at some point, but I'm not quite sure on when. So Docker.engine is a state that's literally just setting up Docker on each individual host. For image, that's our Docker image name. So in order to support multiple versions of Drupal, we need multiple versions of PHP. So Drupal 8 is best aligned with PHP 7. Drupal 7 is more PHP 5.5, 5.6 at this point. So just really depends on what is necessary. We have network modes because we isolate our containers to their own Docker overlay networks. So you can do that within Salt and the Docker ng state or Docker ng module. Port bindings are really just handling making a port available on the host so Varnish can route into that. And we're going to be changing that port binding a little bit since we do have Docker overlay networks fully supported in our environment now. But this is effectively the current configuration. And then the binds are used to set up the mount points. So we don't include our application files inside of our containers. So we kind of use a generic, this is our web application or web server container, and then we mount the application files. In this case, Drupal could be something like Ghost if we had a Node.js container or something like that. Then app deployment, again, we have some custom shell scripting, so lots of flexibility. If for some reason Docker ng doesn't include the latest version of whatever functionality that you need, you can create a command script that can be executed instead of directly calling the Salt module. We've definitely gone back to the Salt configurations or through our Salt states and removed some of our command references. In fact, this has already been removed in the last couple months. So we don't manually stop the container. We've figured out a better way of looping through and using the Docker ng .stopped configuration. And then once we've stopped the container, we're performing a git checkout, or in this case, a git pull. So instead of going out to each server and pulling code, Salt pulls the code to each server automatically. And then we allow the developer to define where they want to pull from. So it could be a diverse number of Git repository or Git services, and then we allow them to choose whether they want to use the master branch or a specific commit ID, whether it could be a specific tag, and we provide that within the revision. And of course, because Salt is a requisite execution engine, I guess, we're simply requiring that before the deployment of code occurs, we stop the container so the mount points are available on those servers that are being updated. And then lastly, again, requiring both of the previous operations to have completed, and then we start the container again. So that brings that would have stopped the container, pulled the code to production, and then started the container again, so the web server is then active and available. As I mentioned, some of the private data, specifically our mail configuration, we don't want to share the information on what those host names are or IP addresses are for our internal mail relays, not that they're accessible externally, but just good security. So we import the PHP mail configuration into the container using Salt. So we're moving a file and making that available to the container using this state. So you can see here's a little bit of information on how we're importing that data or importing the host configuration. I will point out, if anybody's using Docker and needs mail services and they're not using like a manually configured SMTP setting, consider using MSMTP it's a really cool configuration that allows you to do scripted deployment on the site.
Ron, did we lose you?
Sorry about that brief delay, everyone. Just had a phone coming ringing in the background, so figured I would avoid that. So moving on to so what we accomplished using Salt and using Docker, we've gotten really good feedback from customers, and I think Wayne can speak to kind of how the platform has grown and allowed USDA to deploy multiple sites. Looking at the front page of USDA.gov, the platform currently hosts 3 of the 5 top initiatives that are on the front page of USDA.gov. So we're hoping that over the next 6 to 9 months to move USDA.gov to this platform and continue with this model across USDA. Wayne, you have anything you'd like to touch on there?
Well, the only thing is, we're getting ready to. We've kind of done this internally with smaller groups. We're actually in the process over the next 60 to 90 days of putting a new offering out throughout USDA to other sub bureaus / agencies of USDA, allowing them to take advantage of what we've put in place, what we have set up. We've made a lot of improvements as we went along, as we've done test studies on things that we've implemented, and we have found better ways to do things. So a lot of that has been done over the last 6 months, and the other part of it is the production time to do this. We've really gotten it down to, as Ron was saying, as small as 16 days to actually get the site up and loaded. We'll push to even go better than that, but it allows for somebody that has a quick initiative that comes up to build a site out and turn it around pretty quickly, and meanwhile not having to sit there and set their own servers up and take a week to get the server set up. Everything's in place. We can roll things out quickly. So that's what our vision is on this. We're looking at Ron's slide says 150,000+ annual savings, but I think when we really look at it, probably up to a year from now, when we've got a lot of things fully integrated, our pricing may even be a bigger savings than that, due to the way that this has been using the Salt and Docker and other things to set this up and to run it. So we're really excited about the direction we're going in. The value of Salt has really made this very easy for Ron to configure and to build out what he's doing. So very positive things with it.
Yeah, we've definitely seen, both from the business side and even from internally on the technical side, multiple groups have reached out to our team and have been interested. We recently migrated over the main ocio.usda.gov website, so it's always nice to have the agency-wide CIO on board with your platform and moving in that direction. Other divisions, including Food and Nutrition Services, who's been a major supporter of this platform project, and then other smaller groups like Office of Civil Rights. We've also been able to sustain multiple press conferences, of course, one related to the New Farmers Initiative with the Secretary, and then People's Garden, which is an initiative with thousands of locations across the country where people can log in and provide feedback on those gardens. So it's really nice to be able to deliver IT value to business folks that really care about it, and of course doing it cost effectively. So if you have any feedback, I'd appreciate if you could send us a message in chat, or we'll be available by email on the screen there.
Yeah, so thank you, Ron. Thank you, Wayne. Looking at the chat function within GoToMeeting here, we don't have any questions just yet, but let's give it 1 second. As Ron has on the screen here, it provides both Twitter handles and email addresses if you do have any questions for Ron or Wayne directly. And then, of course, if you have questions for SaltStack, you can either send to info@saltstack.com or sales@saltstack.com, and we'd be happy to answer any of your questions at that point. But it doesn't look like we've got any questions coming in. So again,
yeah, I'll do a.
Oh yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Maybe a quick informal survey, depending on how many people are on the chat. Is anybody working with Drupal currently? Maybe just send a yes or something like that in the chat. Specifically, just curious, because about a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, there was a highly critical security vulnerability that came out, and it was related to the Drupal coder module. And one thing that we were able to do was to immediately roll out an update to our configuration that blocked all traffic that was accessing the coder module vulnerability vector. That's something that, while we wanted to patch all of the Drupal sites, and we did patch those sites, when you have presently 10 sites running on the environment, and very quickly adding, as Wayne mentioned, 15 or 20, you want to mitigate those security issues immediately. So we were able to update our configuration routing to prevent traffic access, and then also open source the regex that basically I looked at the heuristic for traffic that was trying to exploit that vulnerability and block that traffic at that time.
Yeah, thanks. And Ron, a question for you. I think you mentioned Bash at the beginning as kind of maybe a poor man's version of Salt or remote execution, but what was your first exposure to Salt, and what were the things, I guess, that attracted you to the Salt platform? And not having to name names or anything, but as compared to either some of the other configuration management tools, or as compared to the other I guess automation options out there and available.
Sure. So I had worked with well, sorry, I will name one name, not in a negative way, but previously worked with Vagrant, which was dependent on Chef. And so Vagrant, of course, provisioning out local development virtual machines, but really not something that could move up the stack. And so the Chef configurations really were specific to local dev, and Vagrant up, of course, running took quite a while. Moving into Docker, we were able to really speed up the amount of time that our local dev actually took to provision. So we knew that we needed good Docker support, and Salt seemed to have the best Docker support at the time. And I think even now it still has the best Docker support. We're adjusting how we're going to be using Salt to control some of our container orchestration in the future as we look at Rancher. But again, we still need the functionality that Salt provides for initial deployment and maintenance of those underlying subsystems and security on the host. So really, my first experience was one of the colleagues within USDA Enterprise Application Services, where I'm located within, had been working with Salt, and I had seen Salt and was interested and knew that it had some Docker functionality within it. And we sat down for an hour, and he gave me a brief demo on what he knew. And so I said, oh, these are these are supporting of Python, because Salt has a very flexible templating engine for its states. And so I said, well, I know some Python. I could use that. And then looking at YAML, YAML is very readable. So we thought, okay, we can use the YAML, and that had parallels with our Drupal configuration. So really, Drupal, as an adoption of through the adoption of the Symfony framework, has embraced YAML as a configuration management, configuration files within the application. So being able to use YAML for Salt worked really well for us within our environment. So being able to use our existing resources or existing skill sets and Salt just seemed like a natural extension of the skills we already had.
All right. Well, with that question answered, we don't have any other further questions, so I think this would be a good point to wrap up our webinar today. And again, Ron, thank you so much for presenting at SaltConf 16. Thank you for redoing the presentation for this broader audience here today. And Wayne, thank you for your insight and joining the webinar with Ron as well and us. We appreciate your time. We appreciate everybody joining. Like I said, we've got this webinar recorded. We'll share a link to that recording within about 24 hours. Thank you for your interest in SaltStack. If there's any other questions we can answer for you, I think we've provided that contact info, and we will be in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rhett.
Thank you.